Did Boris Johnson mislead MPs about partygate? Should the government tax us more or just do less? And the increasing cost of driving a polluting car. This is Politics Live. Joining me today, Conservative MP Conor Burns, Labour Mayor of the North of Tyne, Jamie Driscoll, political editor of The Guardian, Pippa Crerar, and political strategist Joe Tanner. On the programme today...
I'm sure that whatever happened, the guidance was followed and the rules were followed at all times.
Today, he'll release a 500-page dossier to prove he was telling the truth about Partygate, despite these photographs.
Chase it! Come on, buddy!
Do we want all things American when it comes to levels of taxation? But all things European when it comes to public spending?
8 o'clock this morning, rush hour over the Tyne Bridge and the first day of the Clean Air Zone.
Is charging people with polluting cars the best way to make our air cleaner? Let's start today's programme with this headline in The Times. It says, Rwanda deal a blessing for migrants, says Braverman. Yes, the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, has been in Kigali, the capital of Rwanda, for a few days to see how prepared they are in terms of the facilities that will be provided for migrants that she hopes will be deported to Kigali from UK shores, where they'll be able to claim asylum. She said they will have and be able to start a better life there. So my opening question to the panel is, will it be a blessing for migrants arriving here by small boat to go to Rwanda, Conor?
I think the public want this sorted out. We had over 45,000 people last year arrive in the UK on boats. In my own constituency in Bournemouth, we have a number of people awaiting determination on their claim in hotels to the detriment, frankly, of the local economy. It's unfair on them. They are massively exploited by evil criminal gangs who seek to persuade them.
But will it be a blessing for the people who get sent to Kigali if they have?
Those who want to genuinely claim asylum need fear nothing from this process at all. Over a third of the asylum claims last year came from Albania, a NATO-friendly country, a EU accession country. You know, Germany and Sweden turned down 100% of asylum claims.
Although they take much higher levels in terms of asylum seekers.
France and Belgium turned down 98%. This is about deterrence for those who have no right to be
Well, I'll come on to the issue of deterrence. Do you think it'll be a blessing for those migrants who've risked their lives coming across the Channel and who then find that they're going to have to claim asylum if any of these flights actually get to Kigali? They'll claim asylum there and start a new life.
I think what will be a blessing for asylum seekers is to have their claims processed quickly, to be treated with
Here in the UK?
Here in the UK, a little bit of respect and dignity. These are people who are fleeing some of the worst kind of persecution. 440 days is the average time it takes to process an asylum claim. It used to be the case that it was done so much faster. That's what the issue is about. So, you know, if you go back, I think 2014, they changed the grade of the people who were doing the asylum claims. It used to be senior executive officer. They reduced it to executive officer, essentially cutting the pay. A load of people left. There's a big churn. In those days, the average officer processed 14 claims a month. Now they process 4 claims a month.
I like your detail here, but I mean, it is a process point then for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, no, don't think we should be sending people all the way to Africa when they've come here for asylum.
Do you think people should come through other safe countries in order to get to the UK, or if they're genuinely seeking asylum, they should claim asylum in one of the first countries they come to?
I think we really need to look at the language around this, and it's blown up with Gary Lineker.
Well, that's a very calm question. Do you think someone should claim asylum in the first safe country they come to rather than passing through other safe countries in order to come to the United Kingdom?
Safe routes to get here so people aren't going over on boats.
Do you think France isn't a safe country to claim asylum in?
Well, I think if people want to come here, they can and should be allowed to claim asylum here as part of that basic dignity of accepting that we're one world, that people are fleeing the worst kind of persecution. It may be that they speak English and don't French, not French.
Do you think people in Albania are fleeing persecution, a safe country, a NATO-friendly country?
Although
what we're getting into here is an issue of trying to blame
No, I'm
people.
not blaming anyone.
But the rhetoric around it is, you might not be correct.
Well, I'm not. I'm asking, is anyone in Albania seeking, are they fleeing persecution in Albania?
Well, quite possibly. I don't know. I've not spoken to but what I have spoken to is the immigrants in the northeast who have been through that system, and they tell me that I was speaking to a Syrian who was a consultant anaesthetist coming out of Syria, was waiting for ages. He's got skills we need. His English was excellent.
Right. And we've taken over 500,000 people since 2015 from places like Afghanistan and Syria and so on.
It's taking years to get these claims
and that's
processed.
why we've doubled the number of people going into process.
Let me bring in our other two guests. I mean, listening to this debate and this discussion, I mean, it's interesting. They've sort of set out, both Conor and Jamie, some of the issues on both sides of the argument. Who's winning it, if you like?
Well, Suella Braverman's very keen to be winning it, which is why she's gone to Kigali and to try and promote this policy, because a lot of this, at this point, given that the flights to Rwanda are blocked by the courts currently, a lot of this is about the rhetoric and is about trying to get to show that the government's going to deliver on Rishi Sunak's promise to stop the boats, his language, by the end of this parliamentary term, which is a big ask, and actually probably very few people, probably quite a lot of Conservative MPs included, think that that's likely to happen. However, they want to have that as their target. So they recognise that this is an electoral issue. Whereas equally an electoral issue is the point that Conor touched on, which is that in the constituencies of Conservative MPs right across the country, and of course other MPs as well, there are hotels which are packed with people awaiting processing. And
costing a lot of money,
and often very far away from the southeast coast of England, where some of these boats are arriving, and people are seeing up close the problems with the system. So it is a complicated picture. There are no obvious answers. But I don't think Suella Braverman's tone necessarily suggesting this is a blessing for migrants, that Rwanda is a wonderful place for them all to settle, and some of the pictures we've seen of her looking
like
hugely happy are really appropriate to the scale of the challenge that the government faces.
Is there a contradiction too, Joe, if Suella Braverman is using the term a blessing for migrants to claim asylum in Rwanda, but at the same time she has been very firm in insisting that the policy is also a deterrent? I mean, if it's a blessing to go and start your life, or restart it, I should say, in Rwanda, then how's it going to work as a deterrent?
And the issue is also that there's an element of this is about migration, immigration, asylum seekers, but it's also about the boats. And the point is, stopping the boats is not about then sending people somewhere else when they arrive. If you're that desperate to get on one of these vessels, for use of a better word, then do you really think that some media coverage in the UK saying this is a good thing or this is where you're going to end up is going to deter them? Why have we not spent more money and more resources on stopping the boats in the first place and stopping the gangs? And that's the bit that I still find really difficult, is why we haven't stopped it at source.
Right.
Because it wouldn't be about sticking people on planes afterwards. It would be about actually stopping them making those crossings.
Well, Conor, what is the answer to that in terms of, Joe said, a deterrent?
So those are very valid points, and that's why we've got now the largest agreement with France, and we're putting money into French deterrence. We are putting more criminal penalties in place for those gangs who are exploiting these people. But Joe is right. People are seeing these arrivals, and it's a very visible demonstration in a sense that we've lost control of our borders. And one of the things that I am seeing very strongly in my own constituency, in my inbox, is the desperation of these people who are in these hotels, who are on pause. They can't work. They don't know what their future is going to be. They're separated, many of them, from their families. The humane thing is to speed this up, which is why we've doubled the numbers of people processing the claims, get those things through the system. If they have a legitimate right to be here, get them settled here. But it's a message to the criminal gangs. If you get these people here, if you take their money, we will be processing them overseas. We want to deter them sending them.
Let's have a look at this story in the Daily Mail. Boris Johnson, you saw him there in the headlines, to hand over bombshell dossier to MPs today in bid to show he did not try to mislead Parliament about Downing Street lockdown parties. And that's because he's going to have to give evidence, if you like, to something called the Privileges Committee in the House of Commons about exactly what he did do about Parliament and what he told them about parties at Downing Street. It's going to be a 4-hour session. Yes, Pippa, you'll be watching every moment of it. What is Boris Johnson's defence going to be?
Well, so he's being accused of recklessly misleading Parliament over the Downing Street parties. And it's interesting that the interim report, which is really the only thing we've seen from the committee thus far, said it strongly suggests that breaches of the guidance should have been obvious to him at the time. We were quite surprised, actually, by how far the interim report went. There was 4 occasions where they claimed that he misled the House of Commons. And many people felt that that was quite damning. And in response, we've seen a very orchestrated, very strong campaign from Boris Johnson and his allies coming out and, in some cases, trying to discredit the committee. But in the case of this response today that we're expecting from Boris Johnson, I think it's going to do several things. It's going to suggest that the inquiry is unlawful, obviously suggesting that if it was subject to judicial review, it wouldn't reach the bar. Of course, Parliament is an entirely different setup to the legal system, and the committee was advised by a former Court of Appeal judge that the standard of proof level was appropriate. He's going to argue that the inquiry was biased, because Harriet Harman, who was the stand-in chair, had previously tweeted about the partygate scandal. However, of course, we should add that the House of Commons backed her joining the committee, and then the committee unanimously, on which is a Tory majority, unanimously backed her appointment as chair. And it's going to rely, this one particular, at the weekend we were told there's going to be bombshell evidence that was going to come forward, and very little detail as to what the evidence was going to be. And it looks from this morning's papers that there was one particular tweet, one particular WhatsApp from one member of staff suggesting that the line to take should be that they weren't aware of parties in Downing Street at the time. But as the committee has already told us, it should have been obvious to Boris Johnson, who not just wrote the rules, but implemented them and expected everyone else to abide them, whether rules were being followed or not. So that is what the committee will be questioning him on, and why I think we're expecting it to take 4 hours.
You've been one of his fiercest supporters over the years, Boris Johnson. You once famously said that he was ambushed by cake, or by a cake. Do you still believe that?
By the way. Turns out there was no cake. That was a great line for my obituary, which I won't be around to read.
Oh, well, let's not stop there. But do you still support him? Do you still support him in the way that you said?
What I want for Boris Johnson is what I would want for any other Member of Parliament or any one of my constituents facing a process like this. I want a fair process and I want a fair hearing. I want Boris to have, and I think I spoke to him briefly yesterday, I think he is looking forward to the opportunity to put his case into the public arena and to answer questions at length at that committee. Crucially, and we've already covered it, we're not looking at what or didn't happen in number 10. That was a matter for the Sue Gray report. Blame for that was spread pretty wide, by the way.
Absolutely. But you don't sound like you are rowing in behind him, Conor, in the way that you have done in the past.
I have very, very serious concerns about the process. Now, the Harriet Harman point, I hear what Pippa says. Chris Bryant recused himself from the chairmanship of the committee because he had said things that could have been deemed to prejudice his approach to this. Did you read the 3 tweets
that Harriet's put
out? I did indeed. Not only did I read them, Pippa, I read them in your paper in The Guardian. And one of them said, if the Prime Minister, then Prime Minister Boris Johnson, and the Chancellor, now the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, admit guilt, by which Harriet meant accept a fixed penalty notice from the Metropolitan Police, then they are also admitting that they misled the House of Commons. And what is critical here is what Boris Johnson knew at each stage that he addressed the House of Commons. I sat next to him on a number of occasions when he spoke to Parliament. As a minister, there were occasions where I relied on briefing and then had to subsequently correct something that I had said at the specials. That is not unusual.
Well, Conor,
the question is, did he deliberately, did he premeditatedly go to Parliament and lie?
Did he mislead? Did he mislead Parliament? I mean, you said that you backed Boris Johnson when he had told the House, he said in good faith that he believed the rules were followed. Do you still believe him on that?
I believe that Boris Johnson believed that he was correct when he told Parliament that the rules were being followed. And I also believe, and I think this will come out in, I haven't seen his dossier of supporting evidence, but I think many of those in number 10 believe that some of those events that they were briefly attending were part of their work routine.
Just before I ask Jamie and Joe to respond, so you will vote against?
No, I will wait to see what the Privileged Committee report says. I will listen to what the former Prime Minister says before the committee and his response to the allegations.
So at the moment you would vote against, because you've set out a pretty clear defence, because you say you don't believe that Boris Johnson knowingly misled Parliament, but your mind could be changed.
But it would be appalling for me to sit here and say that I have predetermined how I'm going to vote when I'm expressing concern that the current chair of the committee has predetermined, in a sense, her view on Boris Johnson.
Yeah, but you're not on the committee, are you?
Well, no, but I will have a vote. If the committee recommend to the Standards Committee and the Standards Committee recommend to Parliament a sanction, it will be for each member of Parliament, I suspect, on a free vote to reach their determination. But I want to see what the process concludes and what it says.
So you could be persuaded that Boris Johnson misled Parliament over parties at Downing Street?
I think it's a very simple, fundamental principle in our democracy for members of Parliament to listen and to see what is on the order paper before they determine how they're going to vote. But I have to say, I believe, because I know him well, I believe that Boris Johnson believed that he was telling Parliament what was true and the briefing that he had relied on. And I also, it's a matter, Joe, of record that he subsequently corrected when new material emerged.
Jamie, where are you?
Well, what we're seeing here is red herrings and distractions, a 500-page filibuster document. He was at the parties. We know he's at the parties. He's been fined for being at the parties. And we're seeing a lot of fancy footwork to try and divert this.
But respect, that's not the issue.
No,
the issue is what he told Parliament. That's what privilege is looking at.
We have a guy who's a serial liar, and I can say that without being sued. We have parties that were going on where people are having sex in cupboard, throwing up, breaking kids' toys, all sorts of stuff going on like that. And as far as it's concerned, is we are seeing the allies of Boris Johnson rallying around him, not perhaps as strongly as they used to do, but Connor, he doesn't love you, mate. He's gonna betray you. Just let him go. The relationship isn't there
with
anymore.
Respect, that nothing that you have just said is material to the Privileges Committee inquiry.
There will
absolutely
be a process.
Nothing that was said. That was a matter for the Grey report, the Grey inquiry.
There will be a process.
Nothing you have said is material to what
Privileges
Privileges
have to determine. This is your tactic. You try to narrow it down.
What Boris told the House of Commons.
I'll wait till he's finished.
And whether it was true or not. That is what Privileges are looking at. It's very tightly defined, and rightly so.
So there is a process, but this is also about a wider issue about a guy who was in charge, who was covered up the Owen Paterson affair, who had the Chris Pincher issue, never mind anything about gold wallpaper. And we still have people trying to defend him. And you're doing your best, you're doing a valiant job. I
think if you were on Privileges, you'd have to recuse yourself.
And I'm not, because I'm not an MP, I'm a mayor, I just create jobs. I don't get involved in the Westminster bubble. But, you know what, he's not going to back you. He's not loyal to anybody.
It's not about me. This is about what he told Parliament.
But is it misplaced loyalty?
To support due process, to wait for a committee
you have said quite clearly that you believe Boris Johnson when he said what he did in good faith. Joe, where are you?
I find this whole thing really bizarre because on the one hand there's this sort of legal sort of language every now and again and about bar of proof, etc. But in a court of law, a jury would not be identified and would not have the pressure that's being put on them. And I actually feel really sorry for people on the Privileges
Tory
Committee.
MPs, particularly
I really feel sorry for them because no matter what they do, it won't be good enough for one side. And they've still got to work there. They've still got to deal with everybody. It will be seen as whatever is done is politically charged rather than dealing with the fundamental issue. And I think it's really difficult for those individuals, actually. And I'm sure that there are looks at each other and, sort of digs or whatever bit happening in Parliament right now about this whole thing. And the briefing, I think the whole thing's actually really unedifying, and I think it's pretty grim that it's going on. As to what is said, what this dossier will or won't do, I mean, goodness knows, this is a man who's been very creative with language at several points in his career, so it'll be very interesting to see how that pans out for him. But I think fundamentally, I don't think anybody's going to be happy with the outcome. I think that is where we're going to end up probably on Thursday or Friday. We're not necessarily going to be happy with what happens.
Just briefly, the sanctions, if there are any, brought or suggested by the Privileges Committee, I mean, they could be quite serious, couldn't they?
Yes, at one end of the extreme, they could recommend that he's suspended from the House of Commons, and if that is for more than 10 sitting days, then it automatically triggers a recall petition in his constituency of Uxbridge and West London. He's got a 7,000 majority, which should be a safe seat, but Labour seem confident that they could make inroads in that. So whether that actually, when it comes to it, let's see. He's obviously just been re-elected
last week, wasn't he?
Just re-selected for the seat, so presumably he would fight it. I mean, we obviously have to see what the committee says, but that in itself, if they conclude that he needs to be suspended, and it goes through the process which Connor has already set out, and there's a vote in the Commons, and if the by-election is triggered, then that creates, I think, real problems for Rishi Sunak, who currently is trying to keep his head down and let he, as people tend to describe it, the Boris show go on this week. It's again, he's made great steps in the last few weeks of trying to get, the show back on the road for the Conservative Party. We've had the Brexit, the Northern Ireland Protocol arrangement. We've had the small boats legislation. and they see this as an unwelcome distraction, reminding people of all the sort of the complicated and chaotic times that we've had in recent years. And it would more to the point, it would also put him under pressure to, presumably there would be a free vote, but to say what he would do and potentially split the cabinet. We've already heard Suella Braverman say that she was very supportive of Boris Johnson generally. And of course the Conservative membership, who overwhelmingly are very supportive of Boris Johnson. Anybody who's got their eye on a future leadership bid or indeed their own party membership and reselection, they need to be careful what they say about him.
Before we move on, Conor, I just want to talk to you a little bit about what you've been going through over the last year or so. The Sunday Times, Conor Burns. I was traumatised after being wrongly fired for groping. This was an alleged incident at the party conference in Birmingham last year. You've been cleared of those allegations, but what's been the impact on you?
I wouldn't wish this on my worst enemy. To receive a call to tell you that you were being sacked from government, the whip withdrawn, that information to be passed to a journalist by the machine before you even had an opportunity to give your elderly father and mother, your partner, a heads up. Absolute devastation. I genuinely wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy. I have to say very quickly, I got out and about my constituency and was delivering parliamentary surveys. And I remember vividly I was in a place called Coy Pond and I had a cap on, trying to keep a low profile. And a lady followed me down the street saying, Conor, is that you? Oh, God, where's this going to go? And she said to me, I thought it was you. She said, I just want to say, she said, my friends think the same. We've looked at this and something about it doesn't smell right. And my constituents overwhelmingly were absolutely brilliant.
How do you think the party handled the whole affair?
I have the utmost respect for the party officials in Conservative campaign headquarters. I think they were faced with an appalling position that mercifully brief leadership, 44, 48 days, a few more days than Christ spent in the desert, put at them. They didn't know what to do. There wasn't actually a complaint. I mean, the whole thing was a shambles from beginning to end. But look, it was bloody awful. But I look back on it, and there are people in my constituency who are struggling with higher mortgage bills because of that disastrous period.
Because of the Liz Truss quasi quarte.
Joe, I think all parties need to reflect on this. We put somebody into Downing Street who was absolutely unsuited to be Prime Minister. The Labour Party put somebody in as leader of their party a few years ago, Jeremy Corbyn, who was absolutely unsuited to be leader. I think we need to look at ourselves and ask how these things can be allowed to happen.
Your colleagues, obviously, then, who supported her. You suggest in the interview in The Times that you think homophobia might have been partly to blame. Do you feel that strongly?
I've reflected a lot on this. And I don't want to play the victim. That's never been part of my character, but it's a statement of the obvious that it's been a long time since there's been a gay member of the cabinet. You know, we boast about lots of ethnic minorities and different minorities who are in cabinet, and they're not exactly, as I think I said to the Sunday Times, gay people are not exactly in short supply in the Conservative Party. I just wonder whether it would have happened to a straight person.
Do you see yourself back in government?
At the moment, I just want to get on with rebuilding my confidence, which took a terrible, I'm being very honest with you, a terrible knock. Serving my constituents, who I say have been absolutely brilliant, and spending a bit more of my private time on things that I enjoy and things that matter to me. But I am unshakably committed to standing at the next election in Bournemouth West. I was unanimously reselected by my local party, and I relish that challenge.
Let's leave it there. Let's talk about tax. We obviously had the budget programme last Wednesday, and the day after, last Thursday, we were talking about some of the ramifications, in particular the big expansion of free childcare that was announced by the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt. Now, this policy was described by the Institute for Fiscal Studies as creating a new branch of the welfare state. Let's continue this conversation now, but we'll move on to more focused discussion on tax itself. But let's welcome the Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, Paul Johnson. Paul, hello to you. As I was saying, you described this policy as a new branch of the welfare state. When you look at the level of taxation in the UK, is it affordable, or is the state trying to do too much for too little?
Well, what we've had with childcare, remember 25 years ago, the state really didn't spend anything on childcare pre-school, and that's going up to 8 or 9 billion a year once this new policy is in place. So that is a new leg of the welfare state. And of course, the welfare state more generally has expanded a huge amount over the last 50 years. We spend a lot more on health in particular, but also pensions and working age welfare. And the way we've broadly afforded that without, until now, taxes rising has been a very big cut in the defence budget over that period. I remember we've stopped building houses. We've privatised some of higher education funding. We've not got the nationalised industries and so on. Now, what's happening at the moment now with an ageing population and slow growth is that tax is rising really quite fast. And it's rising fast because defence spending is no longer going down. We've got a lot of debt interest spending, and we do have this really quite large now welfare state, at least by our own historic standards.
Right, and when you say that the level of tax is at a sort of record high, 70-year high in historic terms, I'm just going to show, I know you know this graph, but I'm going to show our viewers and our guests here tax as a percentage of GDP in the G7. And you can see there that the UK is actually closer to the bottom. You've got Canada, Germany, Italy and France ahead of the UK. So just explain the context of those figures when we are talking about highest levels of tax here and whether or not we can spend more on public services.
Yeah, so if you look historically at the UK, we've got the highest level. Well, certainly over this first half of this decade, we're coming up to the highest levels essentially ever. But as you can see there, by international standards, and certainly by Western European standards, our taxes are not particularly high. Now, the biggest reason for that is that a lot of those countries, Germany and Italy and France, spend a huge amount more on pensions, state pensions, than we do. Actually, we have to save money ourselves in our own pensions on the whole, rather than getting generous earnings-related state pensions. They also spend somewhat more on things like health and some other parts of their welfare states. You can see we've got a bigger state than they have in the United States, where they're much less generous, particularly with things like working age welfare. So there are very big differences across different countries. And as you can see from that, France and Germany have successful economies with very much higher levels of tax. So there's no reason that you can't run an economy with higher tax or with lower levels of tax. You need to make a decision. Do you want European levels of tax and public provision, or do you want American levels of tax and public provision? What you can't have is American levels of tax and European levels of public provision.
Right. Well, let's put that question then. Jamie, to you, first of all. Would you like to see higher levels of tax to deliver public services that people say they want?
I think what we need is actually to break down a lot of the silo working. So to give you an example, as a Metro Mayor in power delivering things, before adult education, training welders and chefs was devolved to us, 22,000 people a year were getting trained. Now 33,000 people are getting trained for the same budget. So it's a 50% increase because we match that with the employment support, how we work with businesses, how we work with the providers, so that actually you don't end up...
Sure. I mean, and that's a great example for you locally. But the broad question, are politicians, Labour and Conservatives particularly, being honest about the level of taxation that would be needed, perhaps the levels of France, Italy and Germany, to provide better public services?
So the question, are politicians being honest, I'm going to dodge that one overall. But specifically, I think there's an element of where we tax and what we tax. So, for example, I have the power to raise a precept on the council tax, and I've never done it because the people in our area, by and large, can't afford it.
Right.
So it's a question of, though, unearned income, that which comes through
wealth taxes, asset taxes.
Yeah, capital gains taxes. So those things. And I think if we consider the benefit and tax system as one, there's that threshold point where there's a massive disincentive for people.
All right.
That needs fixing.
Well, hang on, Paul, you're smiling. Why is that?
Sorry, I was looking at something else.
Oh, that's hilarious, Paul. I thought you were laughing at what Jamie was saying. That's very honest of you, even if you're not a politician in that sense. OK, so you weren't laughing at what you just said
might
from
need to
Jamie
clarify
about
what he was looking at.
Yes. Will it be embarrassing for you to tell us what you were looking at? Maybe you shouldn't tell us, Paul. What about you, Connor? On the broad question put there by Paul Johnson, do we want to have American levels of taxation, so lower levels of taxation, but then slimmer public services, or the opposite, the European
I think this is a debate that is welcome and long overdue. One of the things that I regret in recent years is the appropriation of language. For example, all public spending by governments, this started under Blair, is now always described as investment, whether you get a return on it or not. We talk about free childcare, and I welcome the Chancellor's announcements on that in the budget last week, but it's not free. It's funded by people who pay tax on profits and tax on income. And I think we need to have a candid conversation with the public. By the way, I don't think it's a binary choice that you have US or European. You can have a mixed model. I think it is something that we should be talking about more, and I don't want to get into the cake analogy, but we seem to spend more time talking about how you distribute the cake rather than talking about how you make the cake larger, how we deal with our productivity challenge in this country.
Yes, because growth and productivity
between ourselves and some other European countries and North America.
But there is still a choice to be made, isn't there, about whether people would be happier paying a bit more. In fact, yes, it was the Blair-Brown government that put that to people, and at the time they voted for it, slightly higher taxes, and we promised that public services will improve. Or are people really not in the market?
Well, the surveys that were done on the NHS were always that people were willing to pay a bit more tax, for example, for the NHS. That was, successive governments have talked about that.
Sense, sort of
but the principle being that people did appreciate if they were paying in, it was because they were getting something out. I think one of the big things that we don't talk about enough, and I think it's become deeply political, is the inefficiencies in the systems. There is no question that everybody in their daily life will have an interaction with a public service where they see huge inefficiencies. And I think it's really sad that in recent years it's almost become like a sort of slur against people that work in public services, that they are inefficient. But it's not that. It's just the systems themselves. My mum was in hospital recently. We had 2 hours in an ambulance before we even got into the hospital. In the hospital, the staff were complaining it was hot, and it was hot. And my mum had a fan full pelt on her the whole time she was in A&E. Where's the efficiency there? We were paying a fortune at a time when energy prices are at record high to heat a hospital that was way too hot, and then they were spending more money on trying to cool it down. And I just think, that the staff were absolutely furious about it, but what could they do within the system? So that was one experience I had, and I think it's very simplistic to make it sound like that, but the principle.
But it's an example.
But it is an example, and I can't be the only one that ever sees this stuff.
It's a good example, but it's also a good sound principle, actually. We spend an awful lot of money fixing problems that are preventable, and whether that's failing infrastructure, whether that's people's healthy life expectancy is terrible. In the North East, it costs us around 1.4 billion across the whole economy for obesity, which is about 10 times more than we get for a transport budget. If we had a better public transport and active travel, these things save a lot of money down the way. We've got to look at that approach.
I mean, the Conservatives have been in power in one way or another since 2010. I mean, the long-term strategy, the sort of prevention that Jamie is talking about, where's it been?
And I fully predict, Joe, that within the year we'll be back and we'll be having the sloganised debates around the Tories want to privatise the NHS and Labour will spend more money because money is always the answer. Take the one you've just cited, a really good example, a passion of mine. Go into most schools now and kids aren't taught how to cook from basic raw ingredients, which are how they build a nutritious diet. I would love to see some of this stuff where the parties actually sit down together and say, you know what? None of us want a health service in this country that isn't delivering for the people we serve. Let's see if we can agree a long-term plan that won't change from administration to administration on how we deliver that.
So that, you're talking about cross-party working there. As Metro Mayor, I've got Conservatives in my cabinet. We've negotiated a new devolution deal with Lib Dems and Independents. And what we've done is worked out how we get better value for money in a local area, because we work with the businesses, the universities, the schools across the board. Are you an advocate of saying that, you know what, some of this stuff is just, we'll get better value for money if we deliver it in local areas rather than controlling it from Whitehall?
So absolutely, and I think actually that this government, I think, has not a bad story to tell on devolution and driving that, and metro mayors and so on. And I would like to see a lot more of that. And I think the Prime Minister is an advocate of that as well. He, for example, was the one who helped, mixed views on this locally, by the way, but he was the one who put Bournemouth, Poole and Christchurch together as one local authority. It's now the 12th largest authority in the country on the basis that it would know better if it was bigger, serving a larger area, how to deliver the efficiencies for the public.
Sorry, I'm just going to bring people listening to this. Do you think there needs to be a more honest conversation about tax and the level of public services that people get?
Yes, always. I mean, I think the slight problem this far out from a general election, a year, 18 months out, is that we're likely to hear less of that, have less ability to have an honest conversation, and more likely the parties will go back into their silos. And that, I think, reinforces the point that we're, 12, 13 years into Conservative government, and this kind of for a lot of people looking at it will say, why is this discussion only happening now? Surely there's been all this time in power. And on the public service point, just very quickly, yes, I think efficiency is part of it, but so many people are kind of feeling that their public services aren't working in the way that they should do, whether it's ambulance delays, whether it's their kids in marquees and playgrounds, whether it's the train's not working, and there's many, many reasons for that, of course. But it adds into a sense, I think, that people feel that if you're putting that much money into the tax system, you need to get something out of it.
Well, on that, Paul, Johnson, do we get what we pay for, do you think?
Well, to some extent, yes. I mean, we've our health service is struggling because, actually partly because we've grown so poorly over the last 10, 15 years that whilst we spend a fairly average fraction of our national income on the health service, that's less now in pounds terms than some of those European countries that have grown more than we have. So we've not increased spending on schools at all, actually, over the last decade and more. And as a fraction of national income, we've not increased spending for decades. So we've made some big choices about what we spend our money on, and where we spend less than other countries, we get less from it. We've decided to spend more on some things, and some sorts of disability benefits, for example, we spend more than in some other countries. So it's a different. We do, broadly speaking, get what we pay for, but it's absolutely the case that some aspects of public sector provision really aren't terribly efficient. And as was said, that's not saying that the staff are inefficient, that's saying the organisation is inefficient.
Right, but can you just briefly, Paul, before we let you go, on the efficiencies, politicians always like to talk about efficiency savings, closing loopholes, doing this better. Would that really transform what we do get out of public services?
It clearly helps, but in the long run, you need to do much more than that. So yes, we could do better with bigger efficiency. And we have these every few years in Whitehall. You have these efficiency reviews and efficiency drives, but that's not going to shift the dial when you look 10, 20 years in the future. And we know that we are going to have to spend more if we want the sorts of provision we have at the moment. There's big choices here, but in terms of the amount we're going to be spending on pensions and on the health service and on social care, and indeed getting to net zero, we're not going to achieve that simply by being more efficient. We're either going to have to decide to have more tax and spending to do all those things, or we're going to decide to do less as a welfare state.
Paul Johnson from the Institute for Fiscal Studies, thank you very much. So do you accept we're going to have to spend more?
I do. By the way, just one point that Paul made, they said we're not spending anything on schools. That wouldn't be the experience in my own constituency.
No, but broadly, he's looking across the piece, isn't he?
He said we're not spending any more money on schools. We've completely rebuilt 2 secondary schools in my constituency. Several primary schools are a huge investment. We're just about to do another
per pupil spending hasn't really gone up since 2010 or before. I mean, just I know you want to give it sort of a little bit of context, but over the last 13 years, it's barely gone up. I've looked at those figures time and time again.
Have gone up enormously. The number of schools rated as good as are outstanding in my constituency are much greater than they were. That's not to say that there aren't outstanding 12 schools, years ago.
But spending per pupil has not really gone up since the crash, or even before, probably a few years. But Jamie, on that, raise taxes then.
And the right kind of taxes. I'm a big advocate of land value capture, so that when we put in new public transport infrastructure, the value of the land goes up. Let's have the windfall to self-fund these things. All right. It doesn't all have to be on working people.
Let's have a look, talking of going on to working people, let's have a look at clean air zones, because Newcastle and Sheffield introduced a clean air zone earlier this year. They're joining other cities, Glasgow, Bradford, Birmingham, Oxford, Bristol, Bath, London and Portsmouth, which have already got schemes, and new ones are planned for Aberdeen, Dundee, Edinburgh and Manchester. Now, they all vary, clean air zones, but essentially if you have a polluting vehicle, you may have to pay a charge to drive into that zone. In Newcastle, commercial vehicles, non-compliant buses, coaches, HGVs will be charged £50 a day, while non-compliant taxi and private hire vehicles will be charged £12.50 a day. Private cars aren't affected. Let's have a listen to what locals had to say when the scheme was introduced.
I think it's a great idea. I mean, I think I wish it would expand further.
Can make like taxis and stuff more expensive, so that's kind of a worry. But we've all got to like play our part.
There needs to be more money, more funding put into public transport to encourage people out of their cars.
You're the Mayor of Tyneside North. Do you welcome the new clean air zone in Newcastle?
It's not the right solution to actually deal with greenhouse gases, to deal with people getting around. So these were imposed because of the air quality, which is good. You know, I've heard cases of kids with asthma in hospital, but half of the particulates that get in your lungs, they come from the tyres. So it's not just about the vehicles. The solution to this is a better public transport system. And if government...
But that'll take time, won't it?
But if they'd allowed us, when this was first coming in 2017, to design our own systems with the right access to funding, we could have got so many cars off the road. It's a better deal for motorists because they're not waiting in traffic. It's a better deal for everybody. Half the people don't even have access to a car. So better public transport and better walking and cycling is the answer.
But pollution is threatening people's health. Do you think they're a good idea, clean air zones?
I'm sceptical. I mean, I've lived in London all my life. And we were told that when we paid the congestion charge, it was going to be about getting vehicles off the road and we were going to be able to move around easier. It didn't transpire. With the same with the ULEZ in London.
That's the ultra-low emission zone.
My concern is that you just seem to spend lots of time in traffic. If you do get in a taxi, you don't move anywhere. And I'm sure that stationary traffic with engines running must be worse for everybody than actually cars that are moving past. So my fear is that it's sledgehammer nut territory and that we don't really get to the crux of it. And the challenge of how do you get people moving around efficiently? Jamie's absolutely right. You know, we've had strikes, we've had, there's been a whole load, Southeastern Railways have had a whole heap of trouble about moving routes where they just chuck everybody off at London Bridge now and it's become dangerously overcrowded. I've mentioned before my mum who's disabled. If I have to get her around, because of efficiencies, lots of hospital trusts are now twinned. So for her to see a dentist, I have to go into central London and I have to drive her because it is dangerous to try and change trains at London Bridge simply because of the way the systems have worked. So there is a bit of one bit seems to be doing one thing and everyone else seems to be somewhere else. And the joined up nature that doesn't work is where actually commuters find themselves really frustrated.
Is there a fairer way, Pippa, of reducing, cutting pollution, I should say?
Well, I mean, the key thing is ultimately longer-term investments in public transport. I mean, that can be the only way. And there are issues with the the various zones. Obviously, I live in London too, and we've seen the expansion of the ULEZ. And you'll hear the Labour mayor argue that it only affects 8% of vehicles on the roads. Yet, for those 8% of vehicles, often they're people that can't afford to upgrade their cars, even if they're getting a £2,000 scrappage fee. So there's something about the timing of it for that particular scheme in terms of cost of living. There's also about the exemptions. People like your mum should be able to travel around regardless. But ultimately, if you're looking longer term, I take my daughter to school every day and we sit on the main road at a bus stop and, I mean, you can smell it, the exhaust and the tyres, whatever is coming past. And she's 8 and I just think, what is this doing to her?
About
of course, absolutely, of children in London. But so there has to be an answer, but public transport, more efficient, more joined up, has to be at the heart of it.
Connor, the Conservative Lord Moylan has submitted an amendment to the House of Lords which would give London councils the power to oppose the expansion of the clean air zone or the ultra-low emission zone. Would you support that amendment if it comes back to the Commons?
So my understanding of Daniel Moylan's amendment is it goes further than London. It goes across the country.
Fine. And would you back it?
To intervene. I'm very sympathetic that local communities should have the final say on what works for their area. And I think, in terms of what Pippa's just said, we need to recognise how lots of people live, how lots of people are heavily reliant. They don't have the public transport options, however, and it's easier, by the way, in London than it is in many areas when you get outside London.
You could, of course, just vote people out, couldn't you?
Well, you could, but I look, for example, in my own area, I visited a school called the Livingston Academy a couple of weeks ago. The local authority won't even let them put a drop-off zone for the parents because they say they should be walking the kids to school, but a lot of the parents drive because they go on to work outside the conurbation.
I'm going to have to fix it there. Thank you very much for joining me, all of our guests. I'll be back tomorrow with more Politics Live at 12:15 on BBC Two and on BBC iPlayer. From all of us, bye-bye.